Thanks, Elaine. Far be it from me, a humble journalist, as opposed to your academic journalist and political analyst and author of forthcoming academic book, we're reminded to correct you on any aspect of your stimulating presentation. But I think you'll find that Hugo McNeill was not, in fact, Michael McDowell's grandfather. He was a rugby player, won about 30 caps for Ireland, whereas Owen McNeill, I think you'll find, was Michael McDowell's grandfather. That aside, thanks for your presentation, and I'm sure it'll contribute to a stimulating discussion when I shut up. Thanks to the Institute and to Jill for the invitation to speak to you again this year. Some of you, those of you who will recall last year, will remember that I spoke along with some other windbags here last year, and the fact that I've been re-invited this year can only mean that you've forgotten some of the predictions that I made last year. I noticed that the X Factor has not, in fact, been banned as an affront to public decency, and global warming is not ensured a succession of mild winters. But I thought what I would do, given that we're supposed to be talking about a review of the year, is I'll just talk about a couple of things that I think were significant this year on the national stage, and a couple of things that I think are significant on the international stage. And as I say, I'll shut up as soon as I can, and we can perhaps have something of a conversation then. I think it was certainly a year where we witnessed some very big changes, some very profound movements politically, economically, socially in our country. And I think that those changes are ongoing. We do this in newspapers every year. We write our reviews of the year, often considerably in advance of the end of the year, hoping that nothing significant happens between the time we start our Christmas holidays and the time the piece is actually published. And there's a tendency, of course, to list in rote the things, the big stories of every month. Of course, if you ever go back and look at what you wrote the previous year, you find, of course, that very many of the things you thought were significant were not at all significant. And when one looks at them, even at the remove of a year, it turns out that the significance that those of us who write on a daily or weekly basis in the media ascribe to the events of the day very often doesn't stand up to any longer term analysis. But that having been said, and those caveats having been entered, we're obviously in the middle of a time of, as I say, big changes, very profound movements. We section off years and we say, well, those things happened in 2010, so now they're finished. But they're not, of course. Those changes are processes, and they wind themselves through our systems and through our lives in various ways that don't begin and end in given calendar years. In Ireland, I think trying to step back a little bit and look at, say, two big significant things that happened this year, became evident this year. I've just picked two. The first is this sort of seismic changes, I think is the best way to describe them, in our political landscape. Of course, these are workings out of the economic crisis, the ongoing economic crisis, but they have, I think, affected our politics in profound and probably permanent ways. And I think a couple of those things became evident this year. And the first is the spectacular decline of Fianna Fáil as the dominant political force in our country. I probably averred this last year as well, but we're so much further down the road in terms of how that effect is working its way into our political system this year. I think it's worth mentioning again. It's worth dwelling on again. I mean, the numbers tell their own story. At the beginning of this year, Fianna Fáil were running at about 25-26% in the polls. In the most recent poll in our newspaper, they were running at 17%. A poll in the Irish Sun, God help us of all places, but done by Red Sea, so obviously a properly done poll. Last week they were at 13%. I noticed, by the way, that Elaine says with some justification that political reform is becoming a sexy story in newspapers, though I know that it still didn't displace more accustomed features on page 3 of that particular newspaper. But perhaps that's when we'll know that political reform really is becoming a sexy story, when Mandy, 24, from Devon, gives her opinion on Fianna Fáil standing in the polls. But that, I think what we're seeing, and we will see, of course, we won't know for sure. We won't know the exact extent of it until we see the votes counted in the general election, which we know now is either going to happen end of February, beginning of March, latest middle of March. My best guess is maybe sometime 25th, 26th of February. If David Coughlin could keep that off politics.ie until after Sunday, I would appreciate it. But so we will, when we see the votes counted and we see the seats counted, we will know the extent of it. But we can say with, I think, a greater degree of confidence at this point than we would ever have been able to say at this point before a general election, that we are going to witness a massacre of Fianna Fáil TDs unparalleled to anything that we have seen before. And when that happens, it will mark the moment of the end of Fianna Fáil's political dominance in our country. And that is a moment of, I think, some significant historical significance. Since the early 1930s, Fianna Fáil has been the big beast of the Irish political landscape. That is about to end. Fianna Fáil have been appointing most of the judges and most of the janitors in the country for more than 70 years. Now that's going to finish. We will see what replaces it, but that in itself, I think, is a very big and very significant move, and it's one of the things that 2010 will be remembered for, even though we will only see its final outworking in early 2011. What replaces that is, I think, still is still a question that we're not quite sure of the answer to yet. And I think when I speak about the political movements being processes, that question has yet to be answered. It's not just that we don't know the answer to it yet. The answer isn't there for it yet. We know that our next government will certainly, will almost certainly be a Fine Gael and Labour coalition. We don't yet know what will be the relative strengths of those two parties. We don't yet know who will lead that government, though at this point all the indications are that it will be a Fine Gael-led government. Not beyond the bounds of possibility that it's a Labour-led government, though I think that that prospect is probably receding a little at this stage. The rise of Labour has certainly been one of the important stories, one of the significant movements of 2010. At the start of this year, they were polling in the mid-teens. Now they're polling in the mid to high 20s. That will give them a seat gain and a Labour Party presence in the Dáil such as they have never had. What they want to do with this is not yet clear, and I'm not sure there is clarity at the top of Labour how they want to handle that. They knew their strategy for getting here, I think. I'm not so sure they know what they want to do now that they are here, and I think that's one of the questions that they will be trying to figure out over the Christmas break, because when we come back from the Christmas break, we will be in a general election campaign to all intents and purposes. The final thing I'll say about the political landscape is the question of the rise of Sinn Féin. A couple of significant things in recent weeks. Obviously, a poll which showed them increasing, but probably more importantly, you had the victory of Pearse Doherty in Donegal, and the decision and the announcement by Gerry Adams to effectively enter Southern politics, to stand in Louth. I think he will win a seat. I think he will become a big player in Southern politics in a way that he hasn't been before. And I think that the Sinn Féin presence in the next Dáil and its status as a substantial party of opposition will be one of the things that is very different about the next Dáil from the last couple of Dáils that we have seen. I think that what you will see once a much smaller Fianna Fáil comes back in and takes its place on the opposition benches, I don't think that Fianna Fáil can credibly oppose much of what the next government will do. And I think you will see them, even though the Fine Gael and Labour government will not need the numbers, I think Fianna Fáil will probably support a lot of what they do in opposition, and that will leave a space for Sinn Féin to be a very strong opposition voice in the Dáil and elsewhere. And I think those movements this year, and the individually with regard to Adams and Pearse Doherty, who is a very talented, very serious player and will be a big player in Irish politics in the decades ahead, I think we're all items of significance this year. The second thing that I would say was significant in domestically this year was obviously the IMF and EU bailout. Again, that is the end of, that's the culmination of a process of, as Elaine says, political failure as much as economic failure, but it marks the point at which the evidence of that failure becomes irrefutable, evident not just to ourselves, but to the world at large, as Elaine says, those of us who are in the business of commenting and interpreting as best we can what's going on in the country tend to be the one. We tend to be approached by the hordes of foreign journalists that have descended on Ireland in recent weeks, and they only notice us now because of the bailout. That's the thing that the rest of the world will remember for Ireland in 2010. You went broke, you had to get a big loan. And I think that that is significant, certainly in and of itself. But the fact of the loan and the terms of the loan agreement are such that they will constrain and tie the hands of future governments, not just the next one, probably the one after that, in a way that our political system and our system of public debate, the way voters relate to politicians, and I'll say a little bit more about that at the end, in a way that we have been completely unused to until now. The fact is that the terms of the surveillance and the terms of the reporting that the Irish government must do to the EU and the IMF mean that the policy choices for future governments are greatly constrained and constricted, and the freedom of action in terms of budgets is obviously very substantially restricted. So I think those two things are what I would say domestically are the big important things. The seismic remaking of the political landscape that has occurred, and the fact of the IMF and the EU bailout and all that led up to it. I'll talk very briefly about international affairs. Again, two things that I think are significant. Firstly, and briefest of all, I think the results of the midterm elections in the United States, where the Democrats took a bit of a caning, Obama took a bit of a caning, I think has it's almost kind of normalised Obama's presidency in some respects. I expect him to win re-election. If Sarah Palin runs against him, it's game over. I think American elections, like elections in lots of places, are won in the centre, and I think it is possible just about for her to get the Republican nomination. I think it's completely impossible for her to win the presidency, and that prediction at least will take 2 years to be disproved, unlike many of the others. But I think that the moment of kind of potential transformation for America has passed. Obama has spent that capital without an international reinvention of the United States. Now, a lot of those expectations were probably overblown, but I do think there was a moment of potential transformation for America's relationship with much of the world. That has now passed. In effect, I think Obama decided, and from what I know of him and what I read of him, I suspect that this was quite a cold and rational decision to spend that political capital on healthcare reform and on the best package of healthcare reform that he figured he could get. So essentially, there's 3 phases left in Obama's presidency. But only one of them is productive in terms of reform and policy making. There's the period between now and the next election, when he's running for, when his agenda will be dominated by running for election. There's the 2-year period, essentially 1.5 years after, at the start of his second term, when he can do things, and I think that is the moment that he will be thinking and planning for. And I think that's when we should watch, when we see essentially the second act of Obama's presidency, what he wants to do with it, and then the final act when he's a lame duck. So I think that the end of the first period of Obama's presidency, I think, was a significant thing internationally this year. And the second thing and final thing I'll say is, in an international sense of significance this year, though it obviously affects us and may affect us very, very profoundly in the coming year, is the ongoing instability in the Eurozone. And we are, I think, without wishing to overstate the case, I think that we are entering a period of make or break for the euro, and by extension the EU as we know it now. The Irish bailout, the Greek bailout, the Irish bailout were all good and well, but they're not going to solve the problem for the EU or for the euro. That much seems to me to be pretty clear. It certainly seems to be clear to the markets, and I think that probably the first 6 months of next year you will see further instability, further market focus on the weaker peripheral economies in the Eurozone, further dips into the bailout fund, and sooner or later there will be a decision will have to be made by not just the European leadership, probably more specifically by Germany, but also by everybody else who has a chip in this game of what we actually want to do with the euro, because it's plainly unsustainable as we stand. I mean, people talk about markets acting irrationally now, but markets act irrationally all the time, and the question is whether your institutions are strong enough to withstand that irrationality, that instability, and the euro as currently constituted probably isn't. There's a lot of talk about Germany giving up on the euro. I don't really see that happening. I don't see it happening just yet. I think Germany will try to save the euro before it gives up on it. The overwhelming, in historical terms, the overwhelming political imperative of the German political elite for 60 years, a priority which dwarfed everything else, has been to avoid a repeat of the late unpleasantness, and the European Union, by extension the euro, is one of the primary tools for that. And I don't, obviously Merkel has domestic political issues, but I don't see Germany making a decision of that magnitude without first trying to save the euro. The issue for Ireland, I think, and I wouldn't be at all surprised if this happens next year, is on what terms will Germany want to save the euro, and whether we will be in or out of that project. And without a doubt, you will have to have, in the new euro, you will have to have much firmer central fiscal authority in Europe. And I think the choice will be for that. And it'll come, I suspect, to an in or out referendum in Ireland. And the choice will be in a much stronger fiscal union, or not just a currency union, in a fiscal union where your budgets are and your domestic spending and taxation priorities are subject to very great oversight and constraints of action by central fiscal authority. And the choice will be between that or being outside the euro, and probably by extension effectively being outside the European Union as we know it. And that is not a very nice choice for Ireland to make. Neither of those two, from where I sit, neither of those two choices are particularly palatable. But that doesn't mean that those choices aren't going to arise. So I think I think, as I say, going back to my theme of looking at the year, I think that instability in the euro is certainly going to continue, and I think it was one of the most important things to happen internationally this year. I'll say one final thing before I shut up, and that's just referencing to some of the things that Elaine talked about. I think that there is a moment of great political potential in the country at the moment. There is a great appetite for reform. There is a great opportunity for political reform and political change. And the question that we will have to answer for ourselves is what sort of change, obviously, what sort of change we want, what do we want it to mean. And I think that, and I've made this point several times before, so apologies to those of you who've heard it before, but I think that we won't be able to honestly or effectively do that until the electorate actually takes a chip in that game itself, to use the phrase I've used already. I think in the analysis of what has gone wrong with our country and the economic and social and political calamity that has beset our country, we've been very good at blaming people, and I've certainly haven't been behind the door and dishing that out myself. And obviously people have focused primarily on politicians and bankers, and that's fair enough for as the recipients, or as the justifiable recipients of blame for where we find ourselves. But I think we have to, in a political sense and in the sense of our own involvement and the electorate's involvement, voters' involvement in the mistakes that are made, I think we have to be honest with ourselves as well. And the fact is that the governments that followed, particularly the government in 2007, 2002, that followed the economic policies were following the pretty strict instructions of the voters. I think there is an opportunity for us to change our instructions to politicians, but that will only happen. And there's a lot of there's a lot of talk, a lot of really productive talk about electoral reform for one thing going on. But no matter what electoral system you have, as long as voters elect guys to give them goodies, to fix footpaths outside their houses, that's what they'll do. And in one sense, our politicians have been acting utterly rationally. Look back at the election of 2007. We now know that we're in the middle of an enormous property bubble. And ask yourselves, what would have happened if Fianna Fáil or Fine Gael or Labour or any one of them came out before that election and said, we're in the middle of a property bubble, we're going to introduce a massive property tax. Our fiscal position is unsustainable, we're going to increase taxes. How would the electorate have responded? How would the media have responded is another question, I suppose. But I think until we admit to ourselves that the voters had a part to play in this as well, and I think it's urgent that we do that now, before the next election, then I suspect we'll continue to make the same mistakes in future. And the political reform is important, it's vital for our future as a country. But until we change our political culture, then the reform of institutions will, I think, be insufficient to A, to get us out of the hole, and B, to avoid making the same mistakes in the future. I apologise I've gone on too long, so I look forward to your comments.
Thanks,